This is a public television special report made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This report, What's Right with the Right. Now, here's your host, David Schoenbrunn.
Welcome to our program. Today we're going to explore a significant element on the American political scene, the right. It has become a cliche to say that America has been drifting to the right. Well, cliches are formed because they're true. And we learned that in November 1980 with President Reagan's landslide electoral college victory, with the great gain by the right, by Republicans and conservatives in the House, and by the extraordinary upset victory when the right, the Republicans, the conservatives took over the Senate of the United States. Of course, right is an imprecise term. We don't really know what it means. You know, right of what? We hear about the new right. Well, where's the old right? What's the difference? What's the difference between a member of the new right and a conservative? Well, we've got a highly qualified panel of men and one woman to answer that question. And let me introduce to you first our panel. Sitting on my far right, geographically speaking, is Congressman John Russolo from California, who's remained a steadfast conservative from the time he was first elected to the House in 1960. He's a strong proponent of Social Security reform, a balanced budget, and he played an active role in President Reagan's tax cut program. Representative Russolo has the distinction of being named the Republican watchdog for the House of Representatives. Welcome, Congressman. Next to him is Edward E. Clark, an antitrust attorney. Ed Clark's a longtime libertarian activist who founded the New York Libertarian Party in the early 1970s. Then he ran on that party's ticket for governor of the state of California in '78, and most recently gained 1 million votes in his run for the presidency and managed to get his party on the ballot in 50 states. Actually, Ed Clark, I think it's correct to say you are not formally a member of the right, but I'll ask you later to tell us just exactly where you are.
Look forward to that.
Now we welcome Willa Ann Jackson, Senior Vice President of the Heritage Foundation, one of Washington's most influential public policy think tanks. As director of that foundation's resource bank, she monitors the efforts of some 450 conservative research institutions. She's also served in the White House as Deputy Director of Presidential Personnel from January to July of this year. And then on my far left, and he is not often referred to as being on the far left, we find Patrick Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan's involvement with the politics of the right dates back to the early 60s when, as a journalist, he regularly supported America's intervention in Vietnam. In 1965, he became staff member for Richard Nixon, later served the Nixon presidency as senior political strategist. He's the author of 2 books, The New Majority and Conservative Votes, Liberal Victories. He currently authors a nationwide syndicated newspaper column and hosts a daily radio show. Welcome, Mr. Buchanan. Then Dr. James E. Johnson, former director of California's Department of Veteran Affairs under Ronald Reagan and former Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Richard Nixon. During the Ford regime, Dr. Johnson acted as advisor to the Government Affairs Committee. He currently hosts his own cable TV interview show, From Washington with Love, which he tapes on Capitol Hill with conservative members of the House and the Senate, and he has also authored Beyond Defeat, an autobiography. Right next to me is Richard Viguerie, who's been called the Midas and the practical right arm of the new right. He's this nation's leading promoter of and fundraiser for conservative causes. His direct mail advertising firm, the Viguerie Company, has promoted and raised contributions for candidates and political organizations such as George Wallace and Orrin Hatch, the Conservative Caucus, the National Conservative Political Action Committee. Former executive director of Young Americans for Freedom, Mr. Viguerie is publisher of the Conservative Digest, author of The New Right, We're Ready to Lead. Now, I'd like to ask each of you to answer as briefly as you can one question that I referred to early on. What is the right? Why do you consider yourself a rightist? How do you identify with other members of the right? Congressman?
Well, I assume the terminology comes from being to the right of the center of the political spectrum in philosophy. Many of us consider ourselves very much in the center stream of constitutional government. We We are supporters of the idea of keeping government very limited, trying to abide by the basic concepts of government in the Constitution, and I suppose the term rightist comes from the old description of sitting on the right or the left, and we find ourselves trying to hold down government from having it become too big and too bureaucratic and all the rest.
And you're not uncomfortable if
And also
somebody calls
reduction
you-
of taxes, I might say. We've always been people who believed in lower taxation because it has been too much. The average wage earner today is probably paying about 43 to 45 cents out of every dollar they earn into government at all levels, and we just think that's confiscatory.
You're not uncomfortable if somebody calls you a rightist.
No, not at all.
Ed Clark, you're not formally a member of or associated with the right, but generally thought of on the right. Could you clarify
By the way,
what
this is one of my constituents. So I wanna make sure that-
Actually,
I
it was a-
loaded this program up.
There was a Libertarian candidate running against John, and whereas I'd voted for him before this last time, I'd left you, John, even though you did win. Libertarians don't really belong in the left-right spectrum. People on the right are thought to be free market people. Well, we are very radical free market people. We would abolish every agency in sight, from the ICC to the FTC to any number. We would slash taxes much more. But that really is only part of our difference from the right, and that is with respect to civil liberties. We think just as we believe in laissez-faire in economics, we believe in laissez-faire in individual life. And so long as you're not using force or fraud against someone else, the government shouldn't try to control you. Prohibition in the 20s was a bad idea. Trying to control people through laws is a bad idea today. To control people's conduct through ethics and morals in churches and temples. That's what those kind of institutions are for, and not government.
So you would reject any kind of
So we are
label.
libertarians. This is the liberal conservative is not an adequate description of the American
You would
politics.
agree with Thomas Jefferson that government is best which governs least, or perhaps not at all?
Absolutely, no question about that. And we would apply it to social affairs, economic affairs, and also in foreign policy, where we would go back to the traditional right policy, which is no longer the policy of the right, of a non-interventionist foreign policy, get out of entangling alliances with other countries, concentrating defending this country, and not get ourselves involved in wars and quarrels overseas.
Ms. Johnson, you're not a political activist. You work with think tanks and academics. How do you identify with the right?
Well, you'll find probably a consistent thread throughout in all of our answers. I, too, consider myself a member of the right or a traditional conservative for the reasons that I believe in limited government, a strong market economy, individual responsibility, and a strong national defense. Now, I may differ a little with Ed Clark on that last matter, but I think you'll find we have more in common in this group than we do have differences.
Do you have anything in common with the moral majority?
Yes, we have things in common with the moral majority. I think in a number of instances, the moral majority is supportive of economic issues that we've taken a strong interest in strong national defense. Those things we would have in common.
What would you not have in common with them?
Institutionally, we don't take positions. Personally, I can't think of an issue that I don't.
That's interesting. Pat Buchanan?
Yes.
What's the right to you?
The right to me represents a movement that's risen up since the early 1960s in reaction, a healthy reaction to what it sees as a country having lost its way. Not in reaction, I'd say, to what you might call welfare state liberalism as it's manifest in the foreign policy of détente, as it's manifest in neo-Keynesian economics, as it's manifest, I think, when you see the moral majority in what you see as sort of the impositions of the values of secular humanism on society. So it is a reactionary movement, I think, in a very healthy sense.
Would you agree with them on abortion, prayer in school, and some of their favorite issues?
Well, with personally, I am very much, and my views are very consonant with those of the moral majority on almost every issue, including specifically abortion and voluntary prayer in the public schools and against court-ordered busing. I think the social issues very much describe what people think about the character and the nature of the individual. And I think the moral majority, while I don't agree with its tactics, I agree with its goal.
Dr. Johnson, without offense, one rarely finds a member of a minority group sitting with this particular group of right-wing conservatives. Could you explain your position as a black militant in the right?
I certainly will. You know that in California, but we also got Congressman Rushlow elected back in the 1960s there. I was known as the last of the black conservatives Republicans at that time. But since that time, that has not been the case, because many black conservatives has now come to the right, and they are now working very hard in order to make this movement solid. Now, what I actually, and I agree with Ms. Johnson on this, there's a thread here that we all agree on. There's a lot of differences here that we don't agree on. One of them, of course, being a military man, I definitely believe in a strong national defense. I believe in a strong policy for our foreign policy. At the same time, I agree with the fact that the moral issues, the moral majority was one that has been there all the time, and all they did was to bring it to the attention to the American people. But there had been moral majorities for years, because I was one of them all these times. But I think that you talk about the right. I'm not quite sure that I will agree with that it's something new. I think it's something that is now being brought forward. I think that we always had these people there. They just was not vocal enough, because the press would not give those people an opportunity to express themselves. All of a sudden now, that it might be a little controversial, that the press has given them a little bit more time to speak and to bring their views out. I believe there always had people who was moral enough to didn't like abortion. I believe that we had people who wanted a strong national defense and also the free enterprise system. I think we've always had those people. I don't think it's anything new as far as we're concerned. I've always had these views all my life. But the point is that it's just being brought to the focus.
Dr. Johnson, it's very possible that it is not the press that prevented them from speaking, but because they weren't properly organized. And if anybody knows about how the right suddenly got itself organized, it's the gentleman sitting next to me, Mr. Richard Viguerie, the Merlin, the magician, and the pickpocket who takes all the money away from everybody by his vigorous campaign.
All on a voluntary basis.
On a voluntary basis.
Oh, yes, obviously.
I might mention that it's probably the thing that concerns the conservatives more than anything else these days is that the conservatives finance their activities on a voluntary basis, $5, $10, $20 type contributions, and our opposition, the left, is financed primarily, probably 90%, by two methods, both of them involuntary. Forced union dues or the federal government. Federal government probably finances 60-70% of our opposition's activities, the left in this country. David, I've been associated with something that's called the New Right. Sometimes people differentiate that from the traditional conservatives, and we're defining conservative here. Let me just say that the New Right really is not all that different from traditional conservatives, what people have thought of Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater over the last 20 years perhaps, except that somehow or another 5, 6, 7 years ago a group of conservatives seemed to have been given a shot of vitamin pills or something like that, and they kind of got energized, and perhaps happened in some of the darkest days of the conservative cause when conservatives suffered some strong defeats earlier in the 70s. Some of the younger conservatives primarily, though not entirely, just felt, gosh, we really don't want to go through life winning a third of the elections, so let's try to bring some organization, some new ideas, some excitement to the conservative movement. And so that's what's happened, and as much as anything else, as you said, it's leadership, perhaps, that has turned this thing around. If the conservatives had to give up everything but one asset they have, I would quickly say let's keep the leadership that we've got, the young, bright leadership that we have now.
Well, Republicans have always been famous for raising very much more money than Democrats, mainly through fat cats, the rich Republicans, leaders of great industries. But you're the man who has gone down to the grassroots level. You get money in small amounts as well as big, don't you?
Of course, that really hasn't been true. I mean, it's been an image that Republicans had lots of money, but because of the relationship that the unions have to the Democratic Party, most Democrat candidates are financed in greater amounts than Republican candidates. It's just that the unions collect their dues, their money through forced union dues, and spend it independent of the Democrat candidates. But it is an interesting thing. that now, I guess, the Republican National Committee has over 1 million small contributors.
That's
People giving
you.
5, 10. Well, we are helping to raise money for Republican candidates and causes, but a number of other organizations are themselves. And maybe 1 million individual people, $5, $10, $20 type people giving at that level. Many of them your viewers, I suspect, today. While the Democrats probably have no more than 60,000, 70,000 people contributing to them, and most of them are the $1,000 type givers.
Pat Buchanan, I've got a question for you. When did this new thing happen that you young people like yourself, organized by Richard Viguerie and YAF and others, started to take control? I think the main difference from the new right and the old conservatives is the kind of slick sophistication and militancy and energy of the new young people
Well,
who
for slickness,
reinvigorated the Republican
and
Party.
sophistication, I'd talk to Richard there. But I think we go back basically to the early 1960s. I remember being in college and talking to a friend at one of these academic gatherings, and he said, "Who do you like in politics?" And I said, "Well, I sort of like this fellow Goldwater, but don't mention it in this crowd." The Democrats had their Jack Kennedy in the White House then, the Knight ideal, as it were, and we were looking for a leader who would represent us, who was not like the 1950s Republicans who would throw a speech into the hopper and then go out and play golf at Burning Tree Country Club, where I used to caddy, incidentally. I think Richard has touched on one of the hallmarks of the modern conservative. That is, he's fairly disgusted, frankly, with what might be called the amorality of corporate America. He's not a squire of the business round table. As a matter of fact, I think Ed Clark will back this up. So many businessmen come to Washington for their subsidies, and if it's some sort of deal with the Soviet Union, for example, they're right there at the trough because there's money to be made. So I think it's a much more principled movement in that sense.
The Libertarian Party, perhaps like the modern revival of the right in the 70s, owes it to Richard Nixon. I was watching Richard Nixon on August 15th, 1971, when he gave a speech putting in wage and price controls for the first time in peacetime.
Which, by the way, he told Congress he didn't want.
And I thought that was an outrage. I think wage and price controls destroy their economy, and there are criminal limitations on working people to make more money or people to sell their products for what they want to. And I called up my wife, who was down in Mexico City, and yelled at her for half an hour because I'd always given $5 to the Republican Party. I'd always been a Republican. I thought that was the free market party, and the most revolutionary aspect of the United States is a free market policy and individual rights, and he had betrayed it. And a guy named Dave Nolan, who was an advertising writer in Denver, saw the thing at the same time. He'd been a libertarian for a long time, and he said, the Republican Party is absolutely true. They don't stand for everything. We've got to have a new party, and he started the Libertarian Party that night.
I think getting back to this, why the right is effective, one of the major elements involved is that we've learned to work with coalitions. There's tremendous diversity within this group. You have a libertarian, a traditional conservative, new right. There's also the neoconservative movement. And we, for the first time, have learned to work together where we can. For instance, the Libertarian Party, the traditional conservatives, the new right, could all support most of the administration's economic program and would probably take it one step further. On the defense budget, we'd be at odds with the Libertarian Party, but probably most of the others of us in agreement. The neoconservatives, they're coming around to our way of thinking, on some of them on social issues, others of them on defense and foreign policy issues, but we've learned to take advantage of this common ground and use it in a way we never did in the past. And I think the liberal community that's been one of their great strengths.
Well, it's very interesting. I agree with you 100% there. David talked about the new way that the conservatives are involving themselves in the political process, the new sophistication, etc. And then that's true. We are doing things now, such as coalitions and forming new organizations that we didn't before. But we are kind of Johnny-come-latelys to the political process. The left has been doing it for 30, 40, 50 years. And your boss, Ed Fulner, the president of the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, Howard Phillips, others, sat around in the early mid-70s and said, my gosh, how come we're always losing elections? And so they said, let's look at the left and see how they do it. They have political PACs. They have tax-deductible foundations. They have single-issue politics. They form coalitions, as Willa talked about. So let's try to do that. So 30 years late, we begin to duplicate some of the things that the left had been doing all these years.
Richard, you don't really mean to suggest that single-issue politics is
That was invented from the left. David, Hubert Humphrey came to national prominence in this country on the single issue of civil rights. George McGovern went around his country.
Civil rights is not a single issue.
Well, it is.
the way he pronounced
Oh, yes,
it.
it is. Ralph Nader, David, is nothing if he is not a collection of single issues. Anti-nuclear energy, this environmental cause, that consumer issue over
How
here.
about the National Rifle Association, the Right to Life group? I mean, you're no slouches at this.
Oh, we're like
Very
Japanese, David. For we came over and duplicated the competition, so to speak, so well, like the Japanese. Americans are running over to Japan, try to figure out how they can do it better. The left is now studying the right, trying to figure out how they can do it.
You've got more PACs, political action committees in Washington, than the left has.
But we learned it from the other side.
But the left came to
I'm not
national...
approaching you.
No, I'm just saying,
I'm just
I want
trying
follow
not
up
to
on
let
what
you
Dick
pin
is
it all
saying.
on the left.
We learn not only to raise money from the wealthy, which the Democrats have been successful and the leftist organizations, McGovern and others, for years. One of the best fundraising letters ever put out was early on for George McGovern, a 4-page letter, cleverly done, soliciting from all kinds of groups. Now, Dick Figure
On a single
came
issue.
Up, that's right, on a single issue, and I wanted to follow up on the single issue. The best example of single issue politics is George McGovern and how he got there and what he did to do it. And Mr. Hart is now in the Senate to carry on in the same way.
Jimmy Carter had a pretty good single issue.
Well,
yeah.
Denouncing Washington.
Yeah.
John,
I
you
wanted
remember-
to refute what was said a minute ago, the implication left, that fundraising was basically a Republican thing with the very rich. Pure bunk. The Democrats for years solicited their biggest fundraisers from the top and wealthy people of this country. The Kennedys are a good example. And we learned from them that you need a broader base, and that's how Dick Vigory and others learned to build mailing lists so we could compete.
Well, let me get back to what you said a moment ago, and let me just agree with the other minority on this planet here, Ms. Johnson. There is other coalitions that the new right has joined, and that is the religious conservative group. For the first time in the history of our whole politics, that we have gone into those areas and we actually got results. Now, the left has always done that. You see, the Democrats has always, they knew that they could go to a black church and they could get that pastor to say, stand there with a halo on and says, I want you to vote for George McGovern, and they would just go and vote for him because the fact he's there with a halo over it. And so we never even once have gone into that area because most the religious people, the Christian people, thought that politics was so filthy and so dirty that they don't have anything to do with it. Well, that's a bunch of stuff, you see, because now we've finally got the people to understand that that's not true, that they are American citizens and their job is to see that people get elected who has some more.
Dr. Johnson, have you had any great success in convincing fellow blacks of that argument?
Absolutely. And in fact, this last election that we had, that we went to the pastors and we talked to the pastors. And here's what they said. We are going to support Reagan. Not really because that we love Reagan, but because of the fact that we're all in a ship. And when the tide rises, we're all going to be in that. And if he can reduce inflation, and if he can cut down some of the big taxes here, and limit government and give us an opportunity to go and work for ourselves, we're going to support that kind of man.
That's a pretty big if. That's a pretty big if. I wonder whether any of you would like to volunteer to tell me whether Mr. Reagan is succeeding or has a chance of success in doing just that. Let's say we'll try Ed Clark and then Pat.
I would like to say that I think Ronald Reagan's economic program has been a disaster because he hasn't had adequate spending cuts. He's going to have a $110 billion deficit this year, go up to $150 billion next time. And there's only one possible way he can cut that down, and that's have major cuts in military spending. And he's not doing that at all. He is having increases in military spending for everything in sight. And we libertarians want to stop the welfare state at home. We think that people should be responsible and take care of themselves at home. And we think we want to stop it overseas too. And what we have is a gigantic worldwide welfare program. Today, or yesterday, Reagan was putting through a 5.7, 5.8 billion foreign aid budget. And what we're doing in Western Europe is to subsidize the defense of that area, which can defend itself to the tune of 70 or 80 billion dollars. Japanese are spending less than 1% of gross national product in defense. We're spending 6. No wonder they can undersell us, because we are paying for their defense, and we want to stop the welfare program overseas. So I think the Reagan program will never make any progress unless they change their foreign policy.
Well, that's not, I was in the Navy as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and if you would see that the way that our national defense had dwindled down to almost zero. When I went there, they had 2,200 ships. When I left there, it had gone down to less than 500 ships in order to control the sea lanes. And if those sea lanes are not open, then we'll have to fly the goods that we get and export and import, and that's going to be a total disaster economically.
I think, Dr. Johnson, that any sensible American in the dangerous world in which we live today wants to have a strong national defense. But I think that's a misplaced question. Even Richard Nixon, who stood for a strong national defense, once said, enough is enough. We've never been able to determine or get a general consensus on how much is enough, and right now, we're running wild with a military budget that is so big.
Let me interrupt there.
That isn't quite true, and I'd like to respond.
Sure, you're going to get a chance to answer that.
Just a minute now. The military budget of the United States now consumes 25% of the federal budget and 6% of the gross national product. Under Eisenhower, it was 13% of GNP and 66% of the budget. In those terms, the present defense budget is roughly at the smallest level it's been almost in the entire post-war era. And I don't think there's anybody around who will say the threat from the Soviet Union is the smallest it's been in the post-war era. So I think what Reagan is trying to do with defense is right. As for Reaganomics, you know what Chesterton said of Christianity. You cannot really say that Christianity has failed because you cannot really say it's been tried. Now, Reagan's tax cuts have not even taken effect, really. And I think that the mistake they made was basically, I agree with Ed Clark on this, was timidity in the tax cuts. They should have gone for 10, 10, 10. They should have cut deeper than they did.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I think
and
we
I
all
think
agree on
on the
that.
tax reduction, it should have been 10, 10, 10. On the personal income tax, reduction in rates, and would have been better. I think your point is well taken, Pat, that we have reduced proportionately our defense outlays through the years, and far below the inflationary increases carried on in the welfare programs, which I know Ed Clark also agrees need to be reduced.
You know, another military disaster like Vietnam will be far worse for this country than even a $100 billion unbalanced budget. So
You're not suggesting that we can avert Vietnam simply by increasing the military budget.
Well,
Vietnam was a political era of great
The political error in the Vietnam War was not winning it, and that was Mr. Johnson's error. And I think you would find general agreement here that if the United States makes a decision to enter a war like that, you win it. And there's no doubt we could have won it because the United States 20 years before that had humbled the Japanese Empire in 3 years.
We humbled the Japanese Empire, not to play the devil's advocate, but just a quick answer, because there are some people who will not be agreeing with what you say.
A great deal.
They'll have a chance at another time.
When we humbled the Japanese, we had a draft, which the American people do not want, which the Republicans do not want. When we humbled the Japanese people, we had a maximum all-out American national effort in that war.
Correct.
And it was a war we believed in because we had been attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. Please don't compare the war against Japan with the war against Vietnam. You're much too intelligent to
compare with World War
It can
I.
be compared, David. It's just that the media that you're involved with, television, print media, the establishment of this country did not send, and has not to this date, sent an honest, clear message to the American people that there is an opponent out there called the Soviet Union that is sworn to destroy us. And they are hiding this message for some strange reason from the American people. And sure, the American people question sometimes military expenditures because they really don't understand that there is a serious, imminent threat from the Soviet Union. And I don't know why the left has such a problem with their friends further to the left of saying these people are quite serious.
I don't think the left has any problem about that. The left and the right are marching hand in hand on the
Well, wait a minute.
military
I think we
budget,
feel-
and the
Oh,
left
quite
is
the-
just
oh,
as
no,
anti-Russian as the right.
Teddy Kennedy and George McGovern want to gut
George
the
McGovern
military.
has been defeated. Teddy
And
Kennedy
Teddy
has
Kennedy
a
and
very
Walter
small
Mondale.
voice.
Oh.
What is your voice? What has the vote been in the Congress on
Because,
Reagan's military budget? Everything he
Because
wants.
there's been a change in the complex of the Congress.
Exactly,
That's
and these liberal politicians can read newspapers and election results the same as the rest of us, and they see the
Congressman,
American people are fed up with
Let
the
me
weak
comment
military.
Congressman, I would like you to
briefly
answer
on the
a question
Vietnam
on
War,
this.
since you raised that point. There was a difference in World War II and the Vietnam War. We did not have a declared war. There is no doubt about that. But also, as Pat has brought out, there was a contemplated decision made not to win the war. And that's the real difference between World War II and Vietnam. We had an administrative decision, and it was discussed. It didn't come out till later in various papers that were revealed, that a decision was made not to go to win. And that was the difference. And I don't think we should engage any place in military engagement unless we intend to achieve a victory or achieve some kind of intervention that is real. And I think that's the difference between the Vietnam War
Perhaps.
and World War II.
Thank God it's behind us.
Yes, right.
Let's talk about the future. And I would like you, Congressman, responsible for voting on these measures, to tell
Well,
me...
some of them. I don't
Well,
vote for
some
foreign
of them.
aid, so you'll have to exclude me from that
Well,
one.
did you vote against it? So in
Yes,
other
I
words,
certainly
you have
do.
an opportunity to vote on these measures. What do you think of David Stockman's estimation that there's $30 billion worth of pure waste in the military
Well,
program?
I think he's probably fairly conservative
Probably
in
more
that
than that.
estimate. I think it's probably a little higher. I think Ronald Reagan intends to get at that, and as a matter of fact, I've been involved in some of the discussions where we talked about specifics of duplicate purchasing and some of those kind of things, and I think that can be achieved. And I don't think, but by the same token, there is an attempt to build up our weapon systems that are needed. Go ahead with the production of the B-1 bomber. Go ahead with some of the things that were delayed by President Carter that are now needed. And I sincerely believe that we need to improve our weapon systems. We need to improve and maybe have fewer people to pay, and we have done that, for military, especially the career people, so that they will make a career of it.
What do you think of the accusation of many of the critics of the military program, including conservatives, that you are absolutely paralyzed by fascination with expensive weapon systems?
Oh, I don't think we're paralyzed.
Well, you haven't built up a decent
I think,
conventional
as a matter of
force.
fact, right now,
We don't have enough men in the Army. We don't have enough ammunition. Congress is very slow to vote for the undramatic things, such as ammunition
Well,
and little weapons and training.
That has
And-
been a problem and a criticism of Congress, but you remember that not until this recent election did the Republican Party or a conservative majority exist in the Senate. We haven't had it for 25 years. We still don't have it in the House of Representatives, even though we're able to fashion coalitions on given issues, that some of which you have already mentioned, to try to save money here and there. I don't think there's any doubt Ed Clark is right. We can make additional savings,
Yes.
and I know our friend Dr. Johnson can probably state some. He was in the military at one time in an administrative spot. There are places to save. The places that we have fallen down is setting aside, improving our weapon systems and our ability to have adequate forces where we need them and how we need them.
I think the fundamental question of military goods and what systems we need is what kind of military policy do we want?
Right.
Do we want to defend Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and the rest of the world, or do we want to defend the United States? And I think there's basic disagreement between myself and everybody else here that I think you cannot have a free economy, a growing economy. You cannot make the United States the idol of the world with respect to civil liberties and provide an example of how to do things if you take the view that we're going to be a world power and we're going to control things all around the world. That $200 billion that's in the military
Let me
budget.
talk to
The
that.
most inhumane and cruel thing
No,
that
no,
I've heard any politician say.
I
They
think
that we
the
will
military
turn our
program-
back to the brutality of the Soviets and let them conquer, brutalize, murder, kill, rape,
I have
pillage
more
their
contempt
fellow
for the
man,
I have more
and
contempt
we're
for
going
the
to turn our
Soviets
back
than
to
you.
it.
I have more contempt for the Soviets than you, and I think they are
But we've
a
got to help
tiger
our
that
fellow men have been
has fangs
brutalized
that
by
are
the
very
Soviets.
old
Yeah?
and weak. And I think the way to get rid of the Soviets is solidarity and the Poles. And I think the way to get rid of the Soviets is internal revolution.
Gentlemen,
and you do not
We would
do that
agree
with a strong military.
Would you say we should spend more money on in the military area of, let's say, $1 billion or $2 billion on a propaganda warfare against the Soviets, radio stations, television programs, movies, pamphlets,
I
bombard.
think the real revolution is going to come out of themselves. Solzhenitsyn has this view that only the Russians can save Russia, and I believe that. Only the Poles can save Poland. And I think if we want to help
some
solidarity,
food.
if we want to
How
help,
about encouragement to look at their system and to rise up and throw off their chains?
I think that I'd like to ask Ms. Johnson to answer a very important point that Ed has raised. He challenges the fact that Western Europe is not doing what it should to defend itself, that they're leaning on us. Many Americans, including liberals and conservatives, and men like myself who've supported the alliance from the very beginning, thinking that our fate is inextricably linked, are beginning to get weary of them telling us Americans go home and don't bring your atomic weapons over, and they won't increase their budgets, and they won't increase the size of their armies. And one fine day, the Americans are going to take them at their word. Now, you work with a lot of think tank academics and people who study this question. What about the fact that we are paying such a big price for the support and defense of Western Europe, and that they drag their feet?
This is not my policy area, but I think you do have a point. I also think that that's something that's being worked on now in the new administration for the first time. The President has mentioned it, the Secretary of State has mentioned it. They've been working with our Western allies, and I think and Japan, which was mentioned earlier.
He mentioned that Japan doesn't carry their share of defending themselves, and you're right, Ed. The reason is we imposed that on them after World War II.
and we ought to abandon that
And we ought to
program.
abandon that. I agree with that. They ought to defend themselves.
That program was installed by a great American liberal, Douglas MacArthur.
Well, we know who installed it for good reason at that time and moment. But I agree with Ed. I think they should provide more than 1% or 1.5% of their gross national product should go to defend themselves.
Well, none of us are really doing the job in terms of national security when the Soviets have a larger military establishment with an economy half of ours. The Americans, for example, we spend the most of all the allies at about 6%. We don't even have conscription. Now, how can you argue that we're being serious about it and the Germans are not when they do have conscription, when the French have conscription? So I don't think any of us are really doing the job in terms of national defense.
Well, now there's another issue I'd like to address, and it's a perfect example of the diversity of thought within the conservative movement, which is so healthy. I think that's going to be a major issue, the issue of the draft. I think probably Ed Clark would
Completely oppose the draft.
completely
So am I.
oppose it. I would completely oppose it. I
Pat,
understand that you
you
three
in favor of
probably
it?
would
I
not.
was with Mr. Nixon when we put in the volunteer army, and I
Yeah.
think that he was right in admitting
right.
it was a failure. I think we were wrong.
Well,
I would tend to come down the side of a draft. I think we've got to look at that issue.
Well, I tell you that being a military man, I just don't believe that you can, in time of war, in time of emergency, you cannot have a volunteer army.
So-
but you will definitely
Well,
have
but
to
you
have
would
that.
agree then you have to have a declared war before
Well,
you have a draft.
well,
I would agree for a draft in time of a declared war.
Well, that might be a little
So we
late.
don't have that.
Might be a little
On
late.
the left, you have those who favor draft, and on the right, those who
you're right. Well, this is
That's my real point, is the fact that how fast can you now
Right.
crank
Mobilize.
the thing up and mobilize and get them out? It might be too late by the time that you get it together. So I have to, being a military man, understand
I
that
think it's a
draft
real
necessary.
difference here. There are many conservatives and libertarians who are not conservatives whose predominant view is the free market view. And individual liberty and free market economics and making the United States an example is the most important thing. And there are other conservatives for whom crushing communism is the dominant thing. And that is a complete dividing line between the two. And it isn't that libertarians like myself love communism. I think it is just about the ultimate evil. The Nazis were close. Maybe they're a little bit more because they were more personally savage.
Well, you know,
But the great enemies of liberty are twofold. One is socialism, and everybody here tests it. And another view is nationalism. And nationalism is the great enemy of liberty. And that's where we libertarians would
get a lot of
differ
agreement
from
on
them.
that.
That's what you mean by
Well,
nationalism.
You know, Ed, it is one thing to express the words that you love your fellow man and that you oppose the Soviets. That's like, but you're not willing to help the people who they are murdering and brutalizing.
You know,
that's like saying,
I'd like
I
to
love
talk
my
that
neighbor, but if he's being attacked and murdered, I can't really do anything to help him.
Without nationalism, the United States would not have been put back together in the Civil War. I mean,
Exactly
nationalism seems to me is vital to the survival of the country.
The
Well, I
question-
think there may be a confusion of semantics here. For some people, nationalism means patriotism, and for other
most
people,
of us, I think it does.
well, but patriotism is frequently confused.
Yeah.
Great philosopher once said, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. When you've got no other argument left, you raise the argument of patriotism.
Well, that's not our definition.
For example, sir, many people who opposed the war in Vietnam were just as patriotic as those who supported the war in Vietnam, but they weren't treated that way, and it becomes a very nasty argument. If by nationalism we're talking of the excessive nationalism, which believes its country can possibly do no wrong whatsoever, that's a nationalism that no intelligent man or woman would accept. I love my wife very, very dearly. She loves me, but we know that we have faults. You can love your country and know that it has faults and try to correct those faults. I think that perhaps you might agree or disagree, you'll let me know, that the left is more inclined to talk about America's faults and to correct
To the
them than the right,
to the
which
exclusion
defends
of any of its
America.
benefits. The
That's
left seems to
possible.
only talk about the faults of
That may
America.
be the left's fault, and maybe the right's fault is that it doesn't examine its own faults enough.
I think the left's problem, the hard left's problem, one of them anyhow, is that it portrays the United States wrongly as a country almost that you should not be willing to defend and save. And we don't believe that about the United States at all.
The right adheres to Stephen Decatur's famous aphorism, my country, right or wrong.
No, I don't.
No,
Well,
David,
I don't
let me
really
just,
think
you
that-
said that you've used here several times the expression the right, and when you introduced Congressman Rousseau, you said, do you have any problem with being referred to as a rightist? And I think of myself, of course, as a person of the right, as most of us here do. But it's interesting that very few people in your position in the media would, if you had, say, Teddy Kennedy here, or Walter Mondale, would you call him a leftist?
Sure.
You would call Teddy Kennedy?
I call him a
You're
liberal.
the only person
I
in the
call
media.
him a liberal because he's
Yeah,
not.
that's true.
Because he's not a leftist.
Okay, but you would call Congressman Rousseau a rightist, right?
Because he
How-
says
why?
he is.
Isn't that,
Well,
Oh,
for
you
many
asked me if I was
reasons.
willing to accept that, and I said fine.
Let me
But
ask
I think I'm a
the
strong
implication is,
constitutionalist, is why
I
I
think
did
you've
that there's
raised
the
an
communists
important
over
point,
here, and
Richard.
there's us conservatives over
Oh,
here.
come on, that's a
but the
favorite
rightist
argument.
leftist
That's a skillful
would you
debater's
refer
point
to
with
Teddy
no
Kennedy as a
substance.
leftist?
I just told you no, because
An
he's not a
extreme
leftist.
leftist,
He's a
how's
liberal.
He's a liberal. Well, why
I don't
aren't we
consider him a
conservatives?
leftist at all.
Why don't you refer to us
he
as
is.
conservatives instead of rightists?
Because you use the words interchangeably. And
No,
I think what's
we
very
don't. You do.
interesting...
The media
no,
does.
you do.
The
You
media
did in your
does.
opening remarks. I'll play the tape back. No, I think you've raised a
I
point
ex-
that I
you
want to
gave me
make
the
clear for the
terminology.
audience. It's very important. 20 years ago, and certainly when we were all a lot younger, the word right in America was a four-letter word. Nobody wanted to be a rightist. It has become respectable.
Why was it a four-letter word?
Why? Because the right was identified with reaction, with crusty old men in the Senate who are against everything, because it was ultra-nationalistic, because they
Well, I
were
think you're absolutely wrong about it. The old right was against World War II. The old right was isolationist.
Isolationist.
Very much so.
Bob Taft was the
Yeah.
leader of the
That's
whole
right.
right. He
He
voted
was a
against
gentleman.
AO. He voted against the draft.
up until World War II.
in the 30,
After World War II,
that was the
old
right-wing
conservatives took it
No,
over.
it was the right-wing conservative senators in the Midwest who were the backbone of fighting the war in the America First Committee.
That's correct.
It was the
Taft
Midwestern
played a major
conservatives,
role,
right,
and all
who were
of them.
opposed to it.
However, the reason I asked the question is only lately, with the ringing phrase, the new right, that the word right has become respectable. The liberals were in command for many, many years, and when the
Don't
liberals
you-
used the word right, it
Don't
was
you think that's
reactionary.
just a concomitant of success? Ronald Reagan was portrayed as an actor with rather kooky ideas who could never be elected
Yeah.
president. He becomes president. In 6 months, the liberals have discovered the press. What a magnificent fellow this is. Why didn't they know it all along?
Well, perhaps because they didn't think he was, and perhaps they're not so sure he
I
still
think
is.
they tend to pigeonhole people by using the term right and suggest that therefore that means reactionary, unintelligent,
Correct.
unthinking.
Correct. And you
We
think
think
that
that's
it's
a
become a
mistake.
respectable word because of November 1980?
I don't think the term the right is yet respectable in polite society in American politics, but I think it is in this group.
Uh-huh. Let me ask this group something. For a long, long time, the cry of the conservatives, to use that word, has been balanced budget. Deficits cause inflation. The worst deficit we've ever had in American history was under Gerald Ford, $66 billion. Mr. Reagan is going right through the ceiling, $109 billion, $152 billion, $162 billion. Does this disturb you that we're going to have this terrible, historic unbalanced budget, and aren't you bemused, as I am, that so many economists of the conservative side are suddenly coming out in articles in the New York Times saying that deficits are not really inflationary. They're changing their tune. What's happening?
Well, I'm enormously disturbed by that, and I think it's scandalous, and I'm not so sure that it's conservatives, perhaps as much as it is the establishment is changing the tune. But as Pat said, Christianity hasn't really been tried, and I don't think conservatism has really been tried.
Well, it's going to be tried.
Well, let me say
in the next
I'm very
4 years,
disturbed
all right?
by it. As someone who has, twice a year, we bring up a budget resolution in the House of Representatives. On 11 different occasions, I have offered a balanced budget resolution, tried to fashion it.
Didn't
Yes, I
you
have.
offer a constitutional
And-
amendment?
Well, I have offered
Or
that
back
before
one?
the Judiciary Committee, and my great, one of the great liberal traditionists, so-called liberals, the chairman of the Judiciary won't let it come out of committee. But in any regard, you know, one of the great, quote, libertarians, who is not a libertarian, he is a centralist. But in any regard, to answer your question, I am very disturbed by talking about deficits don't impact the economy. They do, because when the Treasury has to go out and borrow so much money, it tends to take away from the marketplace money that would be used for other things. So I'm very disturbed by it, and will intend to fight it every way I can. Now, I would like to also say that you haven't found that many economists from this administration endorsing all of those great deficits. As a matter of fact, several of them are very disturbed by it. So I don't think that you can say that all conservative economists have now said that deficit financing has no, from the federal government, has no meaning in the marketplace. It does. It is a tremendous burden on the marketplace.
I'd like to...
And it's not unanimous, I'd like to say.
Yeah,
Nobody suggested it was.
But what I am interested in is all these great, quote, big spenders in Congress who are now talking about, oh, gee, we got to have a balanced budget, and deficits are terrible. But that's phony, and you and I know it's phony on their part.
I'd like to follow up.
Changes.
I'd like to follow up on that business about the economists. We're in touch with over 1,000 of them across the country. Roughly 1,000 academics. Roughly 400 of them are economists, and I don't think you find them backing off. I don't think you find them any less concerned or any less supportive of a balanced budget concept. I will say, too, back to one of your previous remarks, you mentioned previous Republican administrations running very high budgets, deficits. And I think it is incumbent upon us all here to remember that we've had a Democratic, a liberal House and Senate.
Huge majorities in the
That's right.
Congress that voted. The president can't vote one single dollar. It must be done by the Congress.
And we've
And
had-
it was the Democratic Congresses, huge liberal Congress, big spenders, including your good friend Ted Kennedy, who voted for all of those big expenditures.
I don't know why you've
Put that
elected. I
burden-
don't know why you've elected
Yeah.
Teddy Kennedy to be my friend.
Well, he's one of our close and dear
that
friends.
doesn't dishonor me at all. Matter of fact, I have been for many, many years. But some of my best friends are Kennedys.
Are they really?
I'd like to follow up on that issue of the Congress, too, though. Regardless of party, you know, it is a political body, and they're responsive to their constituencies, and each one of them has a certain constituency in its electorate that is always lobbying for that one program they don't want to see cut out of the budget. And it's very, very difficult. This administration and this Congress, this new
trying.
Congress, is trying for the first time. It's made, I think, tremendous headway. But I think we all have to remember, too, that it's only been a year. We're just coming up on a year now.
Correct.
And I think
Right.
they've made good progress. I hope they're not backing off. I hope the administration
I think we ought
itself
to
is
look-
not backing off.
We ought to look at the deficits. Anybody who's interested in cutting back spending, reducing the size of ought to look at the deficits as a great opportunity, because they'll probably never have the courage to raise taxes. But with the deficits so big, there's the opportunity to cut spending.
Right.
And cut spending and cut spending and cut it
Absolutely.
again and again and
Well,
again.
now
Well,
it's
the
interesting.
deficit
You all
is-
agree. Where are you going to make the cuts?
Oh, I'd be glad to give you my list.
Oh, I can guess
prepared a
that.
list last year, as a matter of fact.
Let me
as a
ask
member
you,
of the Budget Committee.
David, would you agree, if there's one place to start budget cuts, that the left in this country should not be funded by taxpayers? AFL-CIO receives money. The Reverend Jesse Jackson receives several $1 million a year. Can you imagine the hue and
Legal
cry from the
Services
media
Corporation.
if Reverend Falwell received 10 cents? Why is not the media focusing in on this massive amount of money going to the organized left in this country from the taxpayers?
I have no conception whatsoever of the media refusing to publish information of this kind. Have you ever tried to write out this accusation and send it to
Oh,
the editor of the New York
oh
Times?
my God.
He writes-
It's the
you
number
read
one
his
issue of the conservatives, but you wouldn't know it by listening to the
Have you
establishment
sent
media in
him a
this country.
subscription of your Conservative Digest?
Yes,
Yes,
I'll
read
send you
about
a
it
free
every
subscription
month.
and some back issues, the Conservative Digest, and other material that shows the conservatives have been screaming and yelling for years that the taxpayers are funding the left wing of this country.
And so is Ed Clark. Ed Clark's publications.
Exactly.
Long list of things.
The
Let
national-
me tell you only one thing that has to be done. We could have had a balanced budget in our federal government in the last 10 years, in any one year, by just slowing down or stopping the increases each year. We have been increasing the spending level at 10, 15, or 20% a year. If we just held it to 5% increase per year, we could have had a balanced budget.
Congressman-
And stop the necessity for add-on to the deficit.
Congressman, is it possible, in your opinion,
Yes.
to increase the military budget the way it has been increased, and to decrease taxes the way they've been decreased, and to balance the budget?
Absolutely. And it was, if you look at my last balanced
It's- see,
budget
it's not taxes.
resolution, it was all contained there. I got 191 votes. It was just short of a majority. It had both tax reduction, it had reduction in future spending, in future spending.
Non-military?
The military was increased by 10 billion in that budget.
If you hold the...
One-
excuse me.
So the answer to your question is absolutely we can do what you have just
Well,
said.
the president has the opportunity to do that.
No, he doesn't have the total opportunity.
No.
The House of Representatives
Exactly.
is still involved in the congressional process. You understand that. And Tip O'Neill, my dear big spending friend, still insists on spending more than we take in.
I didn't have any idea this spring that the House of Representatives was involved in anything. Mr. Reagan was the man who was calling the shots. He has tremendous power, tremendous charisma, and he was able to persuade both houses of the Congress.
Not to
and
reduce
he
the
has-
spending side.
No,
You're wrong.
He wanted to cut much more spending, but he's a realist, he's a politician, and he understands what he can get out of Congress, and he asked for as much budget in the way of budget cuts as he felt Congress would pass. But if it hadn't been Tip O'Neill and other liberal Democrats there, he would have asked and gotten more.
And when he tried to cut Social Security, the Senate voted 90 to nothing against him.
Well, not
Right,
right.
that's a very good point. It's a very good point. There's the entitlement programs and the so-called uncontrollables, the automatic increases, cost of
Right.
living increases. You got almost
Exactly.
half the federal
Exactly.
budget. Now, Reagan cannot cut those himself. He needs the cooperation of Congress, and I don't think he's going to get it this coming
No, he
year,
is not. Let me talk about Social Security since you brought that up. I'm on the Social Security subcommittee of the Ways and Means Committee. We have the responsibility of trying to reform this program and save it from bankruptcy. It's going into debt at almost $19,000 a minute right now. And the reason it is because the Democrats have and the big spenders like Ted Kennedy have kept adding on more and more benefits far and beyond the ability of the system to pay for it. And their accelerated benefits, as brought out by Pat, entitlements, automatic increases, and they've been going up 12, 15% a year. Now, what Congress has to do, all it has to do, and all President Reagan recommended, and by the way, in the Social Security Subcommittee, headed by a Democrat, Jake Pickle, we voted to begin to reduce those benefits for the future, and Tip O'Neill calls in Jake Pickle and says, we're not going to have any of that. We're not going to save the system. We hope that it gets into real trouble. We're going to blame it on Mr. Reagan. And that's exactly what happened.
you
You heard
quoting-
it
are
here
you
on this
quoting
program.
This really is
I'm quoting Tip O'Neill.
You bet I am.
Oh, that's widely known. That's widely known.
I think the reason that the Reaganites haven't made any progress with respect to all these programs, they haven't been radical enough. You talk
That
about
could
tinkering
be.
with Social Security, it's never going to happen. You have to have a major program.
Right.
And I
Sure.
think the program
Right.
with respect to Social Security is to say, we're going to cut spending enough so we can pay the old people off from existing revenues, and we're going to take the young people completely out of their system. We're going to let them save for themselves, or give them tax credits so they can have an IRA, an individual retirement account to save for their own retirement. That'll make us a much richer country, a much freer country. So the Reagans haven't been radical enough to change that major program.
I'd agree with Ed that we haven't been radical enough. But back to this whole conservative movement, the academic community in this conservative movement has come up, and you made reference earlier to the budget and where we could cut. This whole question of privatization is one that's terribly exciting. There's tremendous work going on in the academic community. There's a proposal coming out of Texas, Professor John Goodman talking about contracting out of Social Security, a plan that's worked in Britain so far. There are proposals in terms of the environment. There are proposals in terms of transportation. There's some tremendously exciting work being done and innovative, and I would say that you're right. What we need is to move this into the private economy.
And the other place you ought to move it into the private economy is education.
Right.
And tax credits for education so people can keep their own money and educate their own children in Jewish or Catholic or Protestant schools.
This is all-
That's the end of the call
education
about public
budget.
education.
They talk about trickle-down economics. The education budget, you take $10, $15 billion, turn it over to the education industry. The kids don't get a thing out of it. They're supposed to get improved learning and education. Every single test score in the last 15 years shown it has declined. That's trickle-down economics at its most pristine.
I'd like any one of you or all of you to come in on this question. We're coming down near the end now. Do you think that this movement towards the right that reached a peak in November 1980 is a fundamental and permanent trend of American politics, or do you think it depends upon the success of the Reagan administration in the next 4 years? If Reagan succeeds, the right may be in power for a long time. If Reagan fails, it may have been an aberration. Is 1980 to 84 as much a watershed as the first years of Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
Let me just say briefly that
Please,
this is a trap that many people have been trying to lay for the Republicans and the conservatives to say that the election results in 82 or 84 depend on the success of the Reagan program. The liberals have been running the show for 50 years, and there's no way that Ronald Reagan can come in a year or two or three and turn this thing around. Roosevelt won his greatest victories deep into the Depression in 34 and 36 and 38. And he was telling the people, we're in this problem, in this mess, because of these Republicans for the last 50 years have been messing us up. And so now the Republicans have to say the same thing, blame it on the Democrats. Rightly, for 50 years they've been messing this economy up.
Thank you. I would like to give you each an opportunity. Please, very briefly, there's very little time left. Is there any one thing that you would like to see accomplished in the next 4 years? Any one message you want to leave with the audience on this issue?
Well, yes, I'd like to see a freeing up of the American people. I think they've been under a tremendous burden of our federal government for far too long, and they need this freedom from this tremendous yoke. Get the government off their back and out of their pocket.
I want to get the government out of foreign adventurism, to defend the United States, to cut taxes in half, to eliminate almost all of the regulatory agencies of the government, to establish civil liberties and individual rights.
I'd agree with that also. Limit government and start with the economy.
I'd agree, except where Ed and I disagree. I want to see the United States help these poor, unfortunate people all over the world who are being brutalized by the Soviets.
I would love to see that the government actually give each person an opportunity to do something for themselves instead of putting them on a string and says, here's something for you, but give them an opportunity to do something for
I think the
themselves.
number one threat to the security and survival of the country is the Soviet Empire, so I'd like to see that window of vulnerability closed.
Thank you, gentlemen, lady, if one can still use that word these days.
I certainly am, thank you.
That's a compliment.
Yes.
It's very difficult to summarize a 1-hour program of so many diverse and articulate people, but I think some generalizations can be made. There is diversity on the right. There's disagreement. The right is pluralistic. There are a few litmus tests that are important to them. Get government off your back, free the marketplace. And I think one thing is true. We have young people now. We don't have crusty old curmudgeons who've been in power for 30 years from one-party systems in the South. We have a national right. We have a unified right, a very tough-minded right. And I thank them all for coming and visiting with us today. Thank you, Congressman Ed Clark, Johnson, Viguerie, Dr. Johnson, Pat Buchanan. This is David Schoenbrunn.
The preceding program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.